Hey everybody, welcome back to my coverage of the PogChamps 3 tournament. This is the fourth and final match in the Consolation quarterfinals match. Mr. Beast versus Michelle Khare. And Mr. Beast, he is that small rating favorite and also the seed favorite. He placed third in his group in the group stage versus Michelle's fourth in her group in the group stage. So Mr. Beast is the favorite on paper to win this match, but I think this is a very even match. I think these players are very evenly matched. So I could honestly see this match going either way, and let's just see how it went. Mr. Beast had the white pieces in the first game. He starts off with d4 as he has been starting off. We see d5 from Michelle Khare and now knight to c3 from Mr. Beast. Sort of an odd move on the second move from a queen's pawn opening, but it is a playable move and it's a developing move, so I guess it's okay. We have knight to f6 by Michelle and knight to f3, continuing development. Bishop f5 and g3, looking to fianchetto this light squared bishop. e6 and now bishop g2. Bishop b4 and a3, kicking this bishop away. Michelle decides to trade this bishop for this knight, which is not something you usually want to do. But, you know, at these beginner levels, it's not too big of a mistake. So it is okay. But you generally, you want to keep the pin if you can. So just backing up that bishop. And also you usually don't want to be giving up the bishop pair for no reason. But we have this trade anyway, and Mr. Beast recaptures with b takes c3. We have castles, and now rook to b1, getting this rook on this open file and pressuring this b pawn. Michelle sees this and saves her pawn with b6. We have h3 now. And this is probably not the best move. You know, you already pushed g3, so when you push g3 and h3, it sort of makes your king side weak, and you have to castle king side now since you've already got these doubled pawns on the queen side. And, you know, there's not even a piece on g4 that you're kicking away. So, you know, if a piece ever comes to g4, you can easily play this h3 move if you don't want black having a piece on g4. But right now, I think it's a little unnecessary. I think castling or developing this bishop would have been better. Probably to g5 is the best spot to put this bishop. But we have h3 from Mr. Beast and c5 from Michelle, striking in the center. Mr. Beast has not castled yet, so she wants to open up the center and start attacking that king. We have bishop g5 now from Mr. Beast, pinning that knight, and this is a very good move, I think. And knight b to d7. Michelle develops her last minor piece. And here Mr. Beast plays g4, and this is not really a great move because you're really weakening your king side when you play this g4 move, and you have to castle king side. That's really the only place your king is going to be safe, or it's going to be the most safe on the king side. So when you push g4 like this, yes, it does attack the bishop, but you're going to have long-term weaknesses, and you know you really just got to castle here. Castling is really the very obvious move here as Mr. Beast. So, but we have this g4 move, and Michelle saves her bishop with bishop to e4. We have bishop takes f6. Once again, you know, just castle here, and also you don't want to be giving up this bishop pair for no reason, but we have bishop takes f6 anyway. Knight takes f6 from Michelle, and now g5 from Mr. Beast, and once again, this actually falls victim to a tactic which starts with bishop takes f3, and after bishop takes f3, there's knight to e4, hitting the c-pawn and the g-pawn and a discovered attack on the g-pawn. So you have to take this as white, and after black takes back, you know, the center is opening up and your king has no safety. So it's just a huge positional weakness. You're not going to be able to get an attack of your own because your pieces are going to be stuck defending your own king. So it's sort of a positional tactic, but a tactic nonetheless. Yeah, and it all stems from just this weakening of the king side by pushing these pawns. So keep your king safe. Don't push your pawns that are being used to guard your king, and you'll be fine. But we have this g5 move from Mr. Beast, and Michelle does go for this bishop takes f3. And you might be thinking, can we take this knight with the pawn here? And the answer is no, because after g takes f6, there's bishop takes g2 now, and black will be up a piece. So after rook to g1, bishop takes h3. It looks scary for black, but you know, if you take with the rook, you can just move your king, and you're going to capture this pawn on the next move. And if white takes with the pawn, then you simply play rook to e8, and you know, you can play queen to f3, and this bishop can come back to g6, and you can win this pawn if you ever need to. This bishop will be a very great defender of the king. So, yeah, you cannot take this knight here as white. You have to play bishop takes f3, which Mr. Beast did play, and now Michelle does save her knight and goes for this knight e4, which, as we've seen, is threatening this c3 pawn, which would also be a fork on the rook and the queen, and also threatening this pawn on g5 twice. So you have to take this knight. However, Mr. Beast doesn't take this knight. He plays c4, so letting Michelle, now giving her the option of whether she wants to take this pawn or go for this fork on c3. And she goes for the fork on c3, which is the better option. And now Michelle will be up in exchange. We have queen to c1, knight takes b1, queen takes b1. And here Michelle can now also pick up this g5 pawn and start attacking white's king in the center. But instead she plays a5, and this isn't really the best move because it weakens this b6 pawn. So now your queen may be tied down to defending this b6 pawn and won't be able to pick up the g5 pawn. Yeah, it really just picking up this g5 pawn was the way to go. Yeah. And if you don't see that, then one other thing you could go for is just opening up the center. You see, your king is very safe, white's king is not very safe, and when that is the case, you want to open up that center so you can get an attack going. And a5 doesn't really open up the center very much. But we have a5 anyway, and now c takes d5, e takes d5, and d takes c5, b takes c5. Few exchanges in the center, and black is doing really well here. Once again, white's king is not going to have any safety. Their best safety is really going to be behind these two pawns. Maybe you can castle and play like bishop g2, but it's going to be very tricky. We have h4 now from Mr. Beast guarding this g5 pawn, so very good, not letting Michelle take this g5 pawn now, and rook to b8, getting her rook on this open file and attacking this queen, so that's very good. We have queen to d1 now threatening this d pawn by Michelle, and d4, sorry, Mr. Beast was threatening Michelle's d5 pawn, and she saves it by playing d4. We have g6 now from Mr. Beast. And this is just a really tricky position to play as Mr. Beast because it's like, what do you do? Your king is just so unsafe. But g6, and this simply loses a pawn. We have f takes g6, which is definitely the right pawn to take back with. You sort of strengthen this diagonal, and also you're opening up your rook. You do weaken this this a2 to g8 diagonal, but you can always move your king to h8 if you need to. So I think this is the better pawn in this case to take back with. We have h5 now from Mr. Beast, and this is actually, I think, a good try for a swindle because you want to break open Michelle's kingside, and you know, now with this diagonal open, you could maybe get some attack going. You want to open the h-file, maybe you can get something going there. I don't know. I think this is a very good try at counterplay, though, for Mr. Beast, so I like this move. We have queen b6 now, and here Mr. Beast plays king d2. So I think this h takes g6 move would have been a better try, going for threats like h takes g7 or rook takes g7 or even bishop d5, sort of ideas like this. But Mr. Beast plays king d2, and I think what he was worried here is he knew that he was down in material, and he was worried about this queen to b1 threat, which would force the trade of queens. Or maybe he saw something like black is threatening queen b1, and if I take, then black takes and skewers me. Maybe he didn't see this bishop defends the rook from behind as well. That's just one possible thought process. It's not actually a real threat, but as this bishop defends this rook, and obviously you don't have to. I mean, if queen b1, you can play king d2, and your queen is defended fine. But maybe Mr. Beast just wanted to prophylactically play this move, king d2, which I would say it makes the king weaker, but the king is already really weak, has very little safety, so I don't know. We have queen b2 now from Michelle, and now Mr. Beast goes for this h takes g6. So this queen b2 move was threatening queen c3, but it's not really a threat. The king can come to c1, and it's weirdly white is surviving. But we have this h takes g6, and once again, white has these threats of like bishop d5 and h takes g7. If black just gives white a couple moves, white could even be checkmating here. So black does play this h takes g6 move, and this is not the move. So here you had to play something like queen c3, or even just simply h6, just shutting down black's attack. And yeah, so but instead we have this h takes g6 move from Michelle, and this is actually a huge blunder because now it opens the h file and cuts off these squares from the king. So after bishop d5, which Mr. Beast plays, black only has one move, rook to f7. And here as white, the best move is not to actually immediately take this rook, but the idea is you play rook to h3, stopping queen c3 for one. And also you have this idea of bringing your queen to h1 and checkmating on h8. So you have, that's one idea. You also have this idea of bringing your rook to f3 and pressuring this f7 rook. That's another idea. So if black makes a nothing move, for example a4, then we have queen to h1 and white is totally winning. You can't stop this checkmate. Here the best try for black is actually to give up the queen with queen c3 check, and they would have to play this imbalance, and you're also losing this rook. So this would be a queen versus rook endgame, very winning for white. But here if you think after queen h1, the king can escape to f8 and will not be checkmated because they have the e7 square. Well, this still actually leads to checkmate. We could have rook h8 check, and then after king e7, queen e4 check. And here the best try for black is queen to f6. The other two moves lead to a mate in two. So queen to f6 and now queen to f4 check, king back to e7, the only move, and queen to e5 check, king to d7, the only move, queen to e6 check, king c7, and then queen c6 will be a checkmate. The bishop defends the queen, and the rook cuts off the 8th rank. So yes, you cannot play king f8 there, and this is what white is threatening after this bishop d5 move and rook to f7. But this rook h3 move is really complicated. You know, you have to see all of those ideas, and especially this queen to h1 idea. It's going to be very hard for a beginner like Mr. Beast to see, so he simply plays bishop takes f7, which is a fine move too, just regaining the exchange and hopefully drawing black's king out to the center while queens are still on board. We have king takes f7 by Michelle, and now queen c1 from Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast offering a queen trade. Queen c3 I think would have been better here by Michelle, but instead she accepts the queen trade, and now I think this is much better for white. I mean, Mr. Beast recaptures, of course, but not better for white, but better than before. I mean, I think black had an attack here kind of going, and that Michelle should have tried to keep it going with this queen to c3. But now white is sort of back in the game. Black is still better. Their pawns are more advanced, and they're up a pawn, so black is still definitely better here. And they even have the more active king. So, but white is definitely back in the game. We have a game once again, and we have a rook endgame. I think this is only the second rook endgame we've seen in PogChamps so far, but these rook endgames are really fun to watch. So let's see how it panned out. We have c4, and here as Mr. Beast, I think you have to play king d2 because you got to get your king off this back rank, you know, just to prevent any skewers, and also you want to prevent black from playing c3 because if you leave your king on c1, black can play c3 next, and it's going to take a long time to get out, and it might be hard to do that without getting skewered or checkmated. So here I think you have to play king d2, but Mr. Beast doesn't play either of the doesn't play this king d2 move. Instead, he plays f4, and now this gives Michelle a chance to play c3 once again, just making it much harder for this king to escape without getting skewered or checkmated. So yeah, Michelle definitely should have gone for this c3 move, but instead she makes a really odd move, which is d3, and this simply loses a pawn. So Mr. Beast takes it with e takes d3, and now Michelle, not taking back, but now Michelle plays c3, which c3 is still good here. It's just, you know, before you wouldn't have lost a pawn. You know, you could have done this without losing a pawn, but, you know, it's still good here, I guess. We have rook d1 from Mr. Beast. Not really sure what this move is doing. Maybe he's thinking he can support this pawn, but really your rook belongs on the open file. Rook to e1 would have been much better. We have rook g8 from Michelle. Again, I don't know what this move is doing. Maybe she's supporting her pawn, but you can't really support doubled pawns. It's really hard to support doubled pawns. So I mean, the rook probably would have been better on this e-file, but or maybe even a move like king to f6. But we have rook g8, and now we have rook to e1 from Mr. Beast. So Mr. Beast realizing his rook to d1 move was a mistake. We have king to f6 now and rook to e4. Mr. Beast's plan is to bring his rook to c4 and eat this c3 pawn. Now we have g5 from Michelle, and Mr. Beast takes this. We have an exchange here, and here it looks like you can win a pawn as Mr. Beast with rook to e5 check, forking the king and the pawn. But this actually loses for white after king to f4, rook takes a5, and g5 from black. So maybe this rook to g8 move from Michelle was actually brilliant, and she was thinking she could trade her first doubled pawn and then support the second g pawn with this rook. So yeah, white doesn't have anything here. If you try to bring your king over, you can't bring your rook over to try to stop this pawn. You can't bring your rook to the b file like this because your king is in the way. So if you try to bring your king over, there's simply g4, and your king is going to be too slow. Black can cut you off. So if you try to bring your rook to h5 now, then there's simply g3 and rook to h1, g2, rook g1. It looks like you're good, but then there's king to f3. And after king to e1, now there is rook to b8 from black. And this is actually going to be checkmate. You cannot stop this as white. Yeah, white only has one move to delay the checkmate by one turn, which is rook to f1. And after white sacrifices here, this will be checkmate. So yeah, you cannot actually win this a5 pawn here as Mr. Beast. But Mr. Beast does not go for this. He instead goes for rook to c4, simply continuing his plan. However, this falls victim to almost the same sort of thing. After king to f5, Michelle getting her king out of the way to now push this g pawn. We have rook takes c3 and g5. And here you have to play, or here you should play a move like king d2 as white, just simply getting your king over to try to block this pawn. And this is still a draw with perfect play, but still also very complicated. But instead, we have rook c5 check from Mr. Beast, now going after this fork, and after king to f6 and rook takes a5. Now this is winning for black after g4, and here it's very complicated. But Mr. Beast plays king to d2. If you think that rook to h5 might work, then it almost works, but black still wins after g3, and now you have to stop this pawn, rook h1, g2, and rook to g1, and now it's the same problem. King to f5, king to d2, king to f4, and king to e2, king to g3, and this king will come around and kick this rook away. So you can't bring your king any closer as white. All the squares are cut off, so you have to go for something else like c4, for example. And then we'd have rook to e8 check from black. And after the king moves away, then this king comes to h2 and kicks the rook away. So once the rook moves, black can now trade this pawn for this rook. And this is still a draw after king to c3, but white has to play extremely accurately here. And, black will probably have the winning chances here. White also has some winning chances, but I think black's winning chances are probably better here, especially in time pressure. But we don't have this we don't have this rook to h5 move from Mr. Beast. Instead, we have king d2, and this simply loses after g3. And now you cannot stop this pawn. You don't have enough time to even try to stop this pawn. So Mr. Beast realizes this. He goes for rook to b5, and after g2, rook b1, he is planning to sacrifice this rook for this pawn. But now with this pawn on c2 instead of c4, it will actually be winning for black. And also the king is much more centralized compared to the other position we looked at. So Michelle goes for this, trading the pawn for a rook. Definitely what you have to do here. g1 equals queen, rook takes g1, and rook takes g1. And now c4 from Mr. Beast. He has to try to push these pawns as they're the only things he has left. We have rook to a1 now going after this a pawn, which is going to be the cleanest win, definitely. So very good from Michelle. We have c5 from Mr. Beast, and Michelle picks up that a pawn. d4 from Mr. Beast, and you probably king to e3 would have been a better try here, just so you're bringing your king in and supporting your pawns. And also when you play d4, your king is cut off, so black can simply play king e6 here, and be totally fine. Both of these pawns will be stopped, and your king cannot advance any further. You can bring your rook in to help, and the white king will be too slow to help defend the pawns. So yes, this d4 move is basically lights out for white, but Michel does not play this king e6 move. We have rook to a4 instead, and this allows Mr. Beast another chance of getting his king into the game. We have king to c3 now, and after king to f5, once again, king to e6 would have been a little more accurate. We have c6 now, and now Michel plays king to e6 as she realizes she has to stop this pawn, and now there's nothing white can do. I can't see any form of swindle here from white, as long as black is... as long as black knows what they're doing, I really can't see any way that white can win or even draw this here. So we have c7 from Mr. Beast and king to d7, d5 now, and Michel picks up that c7 pawn, king to b3, and rook to d4 going after Mr. Beast's last pawn, king to c3, rook takes d5, and now we're going to see a king and rook checkmate from Michel, or we'll see, does she know it? Because a lot of beginners do not know this checkmate, which I made a video about this checkmate, so if you don't know this checkmate, then you can check that out in the info card up there. So let's see if Michel knows this checkmate. Actually, we won't see if Michel knows this checkmate, because here Mr. Beast actually resigned, which is definitely an early resignation here. I don't think, especially in the consolation bracket, any competitors should be resigning in king and rook versus king, or even king and queen versus king. You should make your competitor show you that they know the technique, they know how to do the checkmate. So this is obviously very winning for black, but here Mr. Beast just resigned and gave the win to Michel. So Michel takes the first game, and quite a long and complicated game, very complicated. But I think overall, most of the moves were decently okay, decently principled. Michel had a really great opening. Actually, both the players had a really great opening overall, especially for their rating levels. And we'll see if Mr. Beast can take us to a tiebreaker in the next game, or if Michel will shut out Mr. Beast in an upset. So we'll just have to see. I don't think I have anything else to say about this game or this match. So check out my PogChamps 3 playlist up there, and check out the next game of the match on the left side of the screen. Stay awesome. I love you guys. I'll see you next time.